This week in English 101, you are working on the outline for the literary analysis essay. You will use either one of these templates or make your own if you want to. The easiest thing really is just to download one of these templates. For example, the super basic one is the one that has the least amount of explanation. It doesn't have any video links. I have other templates you can use that do have more explanation about what goes where and why. But if having the explanation confuses you or is too much for you to read, you can just do the basics that follow a standard outline. And the format here, if you just use mine and click Enable Editing, then you can backspace what I have and put your actual stuff. For the Roman numeral 1 introduction, you can leave that like it is. Honestly, for the introduction, if you have your working thesis at this point, I will be very happy about that. What I will really be looking for to grade the literary analysis outline is whether or not you have a direct quotation from a secondary source and a direct quotation from the novel that uses the same certain element or theme that you are focused on in that paragraph, and that helps prove your thesis. So make sure that you are able to use in-text citations correctly, but primarily what I'm looking for is, can you match something from the secondary source that reveals something interesting or meaningful about an excerpt from the primary source, a quotation from the primary source. And when I say quotation, I don't mean that it has to be in the novel or in the secondary source in quotation marks already. When you are quoting a source, that means that you're using quotation marks. Some students feel like they have to use something that is already in quotation marks in their research, and that is definitely not true. So don't be confused there. If you are confused about what you can use, anything written in your secondary source or in the novel you can use. You are quoting it. So it doesn't have to already be in quotation marks. Make sure that you are able to connect the ideas between what you're quoting from the secondary source and the primary source in each body paragraph. Okay, so parts C and D are going to be where your critical thinking skills are shown. How are you able to relate these ideas? For example, if I were writing the archetypal analysis, my main idea might be that one character is an archetypal character and important to the hero's journey in a way that shows whatever theme I'm exploring. My theme was education, the importance of that, and the importance or the significance of the denial of education or access to that. And so I would use my secondary source to say what that archetypal character is. What does that archetypal character look like in a work of fiction? And then I would quote something from the novel that shows how that archetypal character is represented. And then I would explain the connection between what I use to define that archetypal character and what is present in the novel that shows that how that works. It's going to seem obvious to me as the writer because I intentionally paired those two quotations, but it won't be obvious to the reader. So make sure that you are making those connections in writing for your reader. And then part D, make sure you relate it to the thesis. Your thesis should say something about a theme. So whether you're saying that Colson Whitehead uses the hero's journey to convey a certain theme, or you're doing another type of analysis, your last sentence of each body paragraph should explain how it relates to the theme, how the overall paragraph does. So do that for your 3 body paragraphs. 3 different secondary sources, and of course the novel is always just the primary source. And you will quote the primary source and a secondary source in each of the body paragraphs. Then in the conclusion, I would love to see your thesis restated in a new way. And then the last parts, if you don't get to that yet, or just put something down to give some basic ideas, that would be excellent. But like I said, what I'm really, really looking for is whether or not you have 2 sources in each body paragraph. The primary source, of course, every time, and the secondary source will be a different one for each paragraph. So I reviewed the archetypal analysis for a body paragraph, how you would work that. If I were doing a historical analysis, my main idea sentence would be a basic sentence about, if I were talking about Brown versus Board of Education, since I'm a teacher and focused on education, I might talk about that Colson Whitehead mentions Brown versus Board of Education to talk about access to education and the denial of access to education in the novel The Nickel Boys, or in his novel. And then I would use my secondary source I would look up Brown versus Board of Education, and I would read something about that. So it doesn't have to be the exact legislation or law that you look up, but it might be an article about the significance of the law. So you can just say something that will relate then from the secondary source, something interesting you found, something that will relate to what you see happening in the novel. So some context or background is what that's setting up, using the secondary source to explain, for example, Brown versus Board of Education, and then quote something from the novel that explains how that's working in the novel. And then part C is the same. Make the connection between what you quoted in the secondary source and what you quoted in the primary source. And then how does that relate to the thesis? So if you are looking at whatever theme you're looking at, it could be anything that relates to historical analysis. It could be education. It could be racism. It could be identity. It could be resilience. It could be whatever theme that you feel will fit with your historical analysis. Another option I've given you is a psychological analysis. So if you were doing a psychological analysis, for example, I have suggested maybe looking at how childhood trauma impacts adults, because we have a main character we see traumatized as a child, and then we see that he continues to have issues with trust and building relationships as an adult. So my research would contain information about the impact of childhood trauma on adults. And I would find something interesting in each of my secondary sources. I would really let my secondary sources kind of guide what I was going to say. And every time I read a secondary source, if I see something that reminds me of something I read in the novel, I will write that down on the article or in my notes. If you've watched previous videos, you have watched how it looks when I take notes on the screen. So you can do that as well. So something from the secondary source about the impact of childhood trauma on adults. Then something from the novel that shows where Colson Whitehead is making that part of the human psyche clear. And then, even though it's obvious to you, explain that connection between what you have found in your research from the secondary source and what Colson Whitehead presents in his novel. And then how does all this relate to the thesis? So again, it's better to explain too much than not enough. So even though it's going to be obvious to you, or you would not have chosen those quotations, you need to go back and continue to explain explicitly for the reader how what you have realized is a connection between the real life psychological impact of trauma on children and what you have found in the novel as illustrating that impact. How does that relate to your thesis? So do that for the 3 body paragraphs. and take a stab at the introduction and conclusion, but again, what I'm mainly looking for is, can you make connections between your secondary sources and the novel? That's going to be the goal for preparing you for writing a draft. Once you write the draft, you will want to go back and maybe put some transition words or sentences between some of these sentences, especially as you are using your secondary and primary sources. It's strange to have two quotations back to back, so definitely you're going to need transitions between your secondary sources and your primary source. So that part will be for the draft, which you will start working on as soon as you finish your outline. So make sure that you read all of the instructions each day. You're going to turn the outline into a draft, and you can see a sample video here. When you're writing the draft, take a look at some of the literary terms you might use to enhance the level of your writing. So print this out or look at it. See if you can use 3 of these words somewhere in your literary analysis. That will really show that you're starting to understand some of the terminology used in English class for analyzing a work of literature. All right, so that is a nutshell of what is expected for this week. You're going to do your outline and then turn your outline into a draft and upload it to Upswing for review. And when you write your draft, I'm not going to make you do all the quote burger colors, but do use red to show the words or signal phrases you use to integrate quotations into your own sentences, and use yellow for the parenthetical citations. Review this video here for how to set up your in-text citations correctly. And if you need any help, please contact the tutors or email me. If you want someone to look at a draft before you even send it to Upswing, you might be able to set up some time with Mr. Hassenbein for that. All right, so that is what you're doing this week. Please email me if you have any questions. Continue to check announcements at least once a day, because I'm already posting answers to student questions in the announcements, and that will be super helpful for you if you have a question about anything, or just to remind you of what you need to be thinking about as you continue to work on this essay. All right, that's the outline and draft in a nutshell. Let me know if you have questions.